The sound of the truck's engine roared too loudly on that deserted road, as if it were trying to drown out the despair in Jake's heart. He was sitting in the back seat, his eyes red and swollen, clutching Lucy, his small Shih Tzu with white and golden fur. The little dog didn't understand what was happening but nestled in the boy's arms, licking his tears, just as she always did when he was sad. Jake held Lucy tightly, as if he would never let her go, but deep down, he knew that this trip was a sentence, and it was irrevocable. Ethan, Jake's father, had his hands firmly on the steering wheel. He stared at the road ahead as if it were his only escape from the weight he carried. The 45-year-old man, with dark hair and a face marked by hardship, couldn't bring himself to look at his son. "Jake, we've talked about this," he said, but his voice faltered at the end. He knew those empty words would never be enough to justify what he was about to do. "This isn't an easy choice, but it's necessary." "Necessary for who?" Jake shot back, his voice filled with anger and sorrow. He looked at his father as if he were a stranger. "She's my best friend, Dad. My only friend. Why are you doing this to us?" Tears streamed down the boy's face as he held Lucy even closer to his chest. Ethan's silence was the cruelest answer he could have given. The truck stopped in an isolated spot, surrounded by tall trees casting eerie shadows. The place felt frozen in time, too quiet, as if nature itself was mourning. Ethan stepped out without a word and opened the back door. Jake stepped back, shielding Lucy like a protector. "No, Dad, please. I'll do anything," he begged. His cries echoed through the forest, but Ethan didn't falter. He reached out and grabbed Lucy. "Don't make this harder than it already is, Jake," Ethan said, though his voice sounded almost lifeless. He set Lucy down on the ground, alongside a small bowl of water and the pink blanket she loved. Lucy, confused, looked at Ethan and then at Jake with her big, innocent eyes. When Jake saw the truck starting to pull away, he screamed with all his might, "And oh, Dad, we can't leave her here." But Ethan didn't stop. From the back seat, Jake turned to look out the window and saw Lucy running after the car, her tiny legs moving frantically, trying to keep up with the ones she loved. "Dad, stop the car, please." Jake's cry tore through the air like a blade, but the sound of the engine drowned everything out. Tears streamed down his face, blurring his vision. When Lucy finally disappeared into the dust kicked up by the truck, Jake's heart shattered forever. But deep in that forest, something was only just beginning. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned to see what happens to Jake and Lucy. Your support makes all the difference. The dust still hung in the air as Lucy stopped, panting, in the middle of the deserted road. Her little paws were covered in dirt, and her chest rose and fell quickly. Still, her eyes didn't leave the horizon, where Jake's truck had disappeared. Lucy let out a small bark as if calling for the boy, but the silence around her was the only response. She felt the cold wind blowing through the trees, bringing with it a strange and unfamiliar scent. For the first time, she was alone. Meanwhile, inside the truck, Jake was leaning against the window, tears forming trails down his face. He said nothing. Ethan, with his hands firmly on the wheel, only looked at the road. The silence between them was deafening. Deep down, Ethan knew something was broken there, something that no words could fix. But he tried anyway. "Jake, she's strong. She'll find a way to survive. Dogs have a natural instinct." But his voice faltered, as if even he didn't believe what he was saying. Jake slowly turned his face, his eyes fixed on his father. "You don't understand anything about her." His voice was low, filled with hurt. "Lucy isn't like other dogs. She can't hunt. She can't defend herself. And the worst part," he took a deep breath, holding back a sob, "she thinks I betrayed her. And I'll never be able to explain that it wasn't my choice." Back in the forest, Lucy began moving again. She followed the path, her nose close to the ground, sniffing the trail of the truck. The wind carried strange sounds. The rustling of leaves, the cracking of distant branches, and something else. Something she didn't recognize, but it made her stop and look around. Her eyes detected movement in the shadows, a figure larger than any animal she had ever seen. A pair of glowing eyes watched her from between the trees. Lucy let out a low growl, more out of fear than courage, and took a step back. The sound of a branch snapping echoed through the forest, and Lucy, driven by instinct, began to run. Her small paws pounded the earth as she followed the only thing she knew, the distant scent of Jake. The creature in the shadows didn't follow her immediately, but its eyes remained fixed on the direction she had disappeared. Lucy didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't give up on getting home, even if it meant facing the unknown. The forest seemed like an endless maze to Lucy. The sunlight filtered timidly through the tall trees, but night was beginning to fall, casting longer and more threatening shadows. Every sound felt amplified. The rustling of the leaves, the whispering of the wind, and the light footsteps of small animals hiding. Lucy kept running, guided only by the distant scent of Jake, blending with the smell of oil and dust left behind by the truck. Even as fear grew in her small heart, something stronger pushed her forward. The need to be next to the boy she loved again. Meanwhile, in the truck, the silence was almost as oppressive as the forest. Jake kept staring out the window, but he wasn't seeing the landscape. He was trapped in his mind, replaying the moment he left Lucy behind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the confused and painful look in the puppy's eyes. He finally broke the silence. "Dad, did you know she waited for me by the door every time I came home from school?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but full of emotion. "And that she slept next to my bed just to make sure I was okay? How is she going to understand that I'm not coming back?" Ethan gripped the steering wheel, Jake's words hitting him like a blow. He didn't answer right away. The road ahead seemed endless, but in reality, he was running from what he had left behind. "Jake, sometimes life requires sacrifices. I didn't want it to be this way, but we can't give her what she needs." He knew his excuse sounded empty. The pain in Jake's eyes was a mirror of his own guilt, but he didn't have the strength to admit it. Back in the forest, Lucy stumbled over a fallen branch, crashing to the ground with a small whimper. Her paws were scratched, and her fur was dirty with dirt and leaves. She stayed there for a moment, panting, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Desperation began to grow inside her. For a brief moment, she almost gave up, but as she lifted her head, she once again smelled Jake. Faint but still there, Lucy got up, determined. The pain in her paws didn't matter. All that mattered was finding him. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence of the forest. It wasn't the song of birds or the rustling of leaves. It was something heavy, like careful but firm steps. Lucy stopped, her ears alert. She smelled it before she saw it. Something strange and threatening was near. The same pair of glowing eyes she had seen before now moved between the trees, faster, closer. Lucy growled, trying to seem bigger than she was, but her small body trembled. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Lucy didn't wait. With all the strength she had left, she started running again, dodging trees and jumping over exposed roots. Her heart pounded fast, fear pushing every step. Jake's scent was now weaker, almost non-existent, but she couldn't give up. As she ran, an idea seemed to shine in her eyes. Lucy wasn't just trying to reach Jake. She was trying to prove something, that she would never leave his side, no matter how far he went. Darkness fell over the forest like a heavy blanket, muffling all sounds except for the occasional rustling of the leaves. Lucy pushed forward with difficulty, her paws now injured from running so much. Jake's scent seemed farther away, almost lost, but she kept going, guided by a determination no human would ever understand. Every step felt like a battle, but her love for Jake kept her moving. She knew he needed her as much as she needed him. In the truck, Jake couldn't bear the weight of the silence anymore. It felt as if something vital had been ripped away from him, leaving an emptiness that couldn't be filled. "Dad, we have to go back," he said suddenly, his voice firm yet filled with emotion. Ethan, surprised, glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing the determined look on his son's face. "Jake, you know that's not possible. We can't go back." But Ethan's conviction was no longer as strong as before. Jake leaned forward, trying to reach the steering wheel. "You don't understand. Lucy won't survive on her own. She trusts me," he shouted. The pain and desperation in his voice were impossible to ignore. Ethan, overcome with guilt and doubt, let out a long sigh and finally pulled the truck over to the side of the road. "Jake," he started but couldn't finish. The words were stuck in his throat. He knew he was wrong, but admitting it was harder than he could have imagined. In the woods, Lucy began to feel the chill of the night. Her small fur wasn't enough to protect her from the dropping temperature, and she shivered as she walked. Jake's scent had completely faded by now, but she kept going, guided purely by instinct. Suddenly, a noise behind her caught her attention. Lucy stopped and glanced over her shoulder. The same bright eyes were there, closer than before, this time accompanied by a low, threatening growl. Lucy's heart raced. She knew she couldn't run forever. With a soft snarl, she faced the shadows, her small body trembling but still. The bright eyes moved forward slowly, revealing a large coyote, thin and hungry. It bared its teeth, taking a step closer with each move. Lucy didn't know what to do. She growled and barked, but her voice sounded like a distant echo against the darkness. Just as the coyote was about to strike, a loud engine noise echoed through the forest. Lucy quickly turned her head. The sound of Ethan's truck was getting closer, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The coyote hesitated for a moment, then backed off, disappearing into the trees. Lucy, panting and trembling, looked towards the lights, and then, even exhausted and injured, she started running again. She knew that light could only mean one thing. Jake was coming back to get her. The headlights of the truck cut through the darkness of the woods like a promise of salvation. Lucy, with sore paws and her heart racing, ran toward the lights. Each step was a struggle against exhaustion, but the sound of the engine and the memory of Jake's face pushed her forward. She could almost hear him calling her name, and that was all that mattered. Even when she stumbled over a fallen branch and fell to the side, Lucy got up, determined to keep going. Inside the truck, Jake had his face pressed against the window, his eyes desperately searching for any sign of Lucy. "Slow down, Dad. She might be close," he begged. Ethan pressed his lips together, his expression a mix of guilt and anxiety. "I'm going as slow as I can, Jake, but we need to be careful. I don't want to run her over." He turned on the high beams, lighting up the road and the edges of the woods, silently praying that it wasn't too late. And then they saw her. Jake was the first to spot a small silhouette emerging from the shadows, awkwardly running toward the light. "It's her. It's Lucy," he shouted, his voice thick with a mix of relief and desperation. Ethan slammed on the brakes, making the truck slide a few meters before coming to a stop. Jake didn't wait for the vehicle to be fully still. He opened the door and jumped out, running toward the small figure stumbling down the road. Lucy saw Jake and let out a weak but emotional bark. Her paws trembled, but she managed to take the last few steps toward him before collapsing on the ground, exhausted. Jake dropped to his knees, holding her gently and wrapping her in his arms. "I found you, Lucy. I found you," he said through sobs, gently stroking her. Lucy licked his face, her little tail wagging weakly. Even on the brink of exhaustion, she seemed to smile. Ethan stepped out of the truck and stood a few meters away, watching the scene. His heart ached seeing his son so desperate and little Lucy so vulnerable. He knew he had made the wrong decision. Finally, he approached slowly, kneeling next to them. "Jake," he began, but couldn't finish. Instead, he reached out and gently petted Lucy's head. The little dog looked up at him with trusting eyes, as if saying, "It's okay. I still trust you." Jake looked up at his father, still with tears streaming down his face. "Never again, Dad. Never ask me to leave her again. She's my family." Ethan took a deep breath and nodded, feeling the weight of his son's words. He knew sacrifices would be necessary, but now he understood that some things were more important than money or hardships. He helped Jake carry Lucy into the truck, wrapping her in the pink blanket they had left behind. Deep down, they all knew that night would change their lives forever. Now, we want to know, what would you do in Jake's place when your best friend needs help? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight until the end for someone you love? Share your story in the comments. Let's talk. The truck swayed gently as Ethan drove back home. Lucy was lying in Jake's lap, wrapped in the pink blanket. Her eyes were half closed from exhaustion, but she still kept her head resting on the boy's chest, listening to the familiar sound of his heartbeat. Jake gently stroked her, his fingers gliding through her soft fur, as if afraid she might disappear again. The weight of what he had almost lost made his heart ache, but Lucy's presence in his arms was what kept him strong. Ethan looked at the road ahead, but his mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. He couldn't ignore the intensity of the connection between Jake and Lucy, something he had never fully understood until that night. He saw the love in his son's eyes when Jake jumped out of the truck and ran to hug her. He realized that Lucy was more than just a dog. She was Jake's emotional anchor, especially after everything the family had been through in the past few years. Jake's voice broke the silence. "Thanks for coming back, Dad," he said quietly, without anger, but also without the same warmth he once had. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing his son's tired face, still marked by tears. He knew he'd need to earn Jake's trust again, but that would take time. I made a mistake, Jake," Ethan admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see I wasn't. I'll never ask you to be apart from her again. Promise?" Jake didn't respond immediately, but his grip on Lucy tightened. He wanted to believe his father's words, but the fear of losing Lucy again was still a shadow in his heart. After a few moments, he looked at Ethan. "You'd better keep that promise, because if you don't, I'll never forgive you." The words were harsh for such a young boy, but they reflected the deep impact of what had happened that night. When they got home, Ethan helped Jake carry Lucy inside. He brought some water and food, placing the bowls on the kitchen floor. Lucy, despite being exhausted, licked the water eagerly while Jake watched her closely, still kneeling beside her. "You're strong, Lucy. I knew you could make it," he said with a soft smile, his voice choked. Lucy wagged her tail, seeming to understand every word. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway watching the scene. For the first time in years, he felt something different. A mix of hope and determination. He knew he would have to work hard to make things better for his family. But above all, he knew that Jake and Lucy deserved the effort. And in that moment, while Lucy rested next to Jake, it seemed like the first step toward a new beginning had been taken. The next morning arrived quietly, bringing with it a sense of calm that hadn't been felt in the house for a long time. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtain of Jake's room, where Lucy was curled up in the blanket at the foot of the bed. Jake, still tired from the night before, slowly opened his eyes and looked at his loyal companion. She was sleeping deeply, but when she heard the sound of the boy's breathing, she lifted her head and stared at him with a look of pure devotion. Jake smiled and reached out to pet her, feeling a wave of relief that she was there, alive and safe. Ethan was in the kitchen, preparing a simple toast with coffee. He glanced at the clock on the wall, the ticking of the hands seeming louder in the silence. It felt strange to be home so early. In recent months, he had been constantly away, trying to find any temporary work to keep up with the bills. But after what happened the night before, he knew he needed to rethink his priorities. As he placed the mug on the table, he heard small footsteps approaching. Jake entered the kitchen with Lucy in his arms, the expression on the boy's face one of pure determination. He carefully placed the little dog on the floor and sat at the table. "Good morning, Dad," he said, with an unusual formality for someone his age. Ethan looked up, surprised, but answered with a weak smile. "Good morning, Jake. Did you sleep well?" He knew the question was more of an attempt to break the ice, but Jake went straight to the point. "Dad, we need to talk about Lucy." Jake's voice was serious, almost grown up. He crossed his arms and leaned forward. "I know you're going through tough times, and I know taking care of her costs money, but I'll help. Promise. I can wash the neighbors' cars, mow the lawn, anything to make some money and help buy her food." Jake's words caught Ethan off guard. He looked at his son and saw something he hadn't noticed before. A growing maturity, born from the love and responsibility he felt for Lucy. Ethan sighed, running his hand through his hair. "Jake, I didn't want you to feel this pressure. It's not fair to you." He looked at the little dog, now sitting beside Jake, staring at him as if she understood every word. Jake shook his head. "I don't mind, Dad. Lucy would do anything for me. Remember? She chased after the truck. She really loves me, and I need to show her that I'd do anything for her too." The conviction in Jake's voice made something inside Ethan change. He realized that, despite the problems they were facing, there was something bigger and more important at play: the unbreakable bond between the boy and his puppy. And in that moment, he decided that he would never risk that again. The morning was quiet, but filled with a different kind of energy in the small family home. Jake, now driven by a renewed sense of purpose, spent hours with Lucy by his side, scribbling ideas on an old piece of paper. He wanted to help relieve the pressure on his father and ensure that Lucy would never be seen as a burden again. Ethan watched his son from the kitchen, his expression a mix of pride and concern. It was clear that Jake was determined, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was responsible for the situation they were in. "What are you writing there?" Ethan asked, approaching carefully. Jake looked up and gave a small smile. "It's a plan, Dad, to help take care of Lucy and even help with the bills. I thought maybe we could do something together, like selling lemonade on the street or fixing old things for the neighbors." The excitement in Jake's voice was contagious, but also filled with an innocence that made Ethan's heart tighten. Ethan knelt beside Jake and looked at the scribbles on the paper. "You're a special kid, Jake. Much more than I deserve." His voice faltered, but he quickly composed himself. "Let's think together about something that will work, okay? But you don't have to carry this alone. I promise I'll do everything I can so that we never have to make such hard decisions again." As Ethan spoke, Lucy watched the two of them, as if she understood that she was at the center of something important. She wagged her tail slowly, letting out little barks that seemed to support Jake's plan. Ethan smiled and ran his hand over her head. "Looks like even Lucy is on our side." "Huh?" he joked, trying to lighten the mood. Jake laughed, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. From that moment on, father and son began working together. Ethan got an extra shift at the local shop, while Jake, true to his word, started offering services like lawn mowing and dog walking for the neighbors. Lucy accompanied him on every task, wagging her tail and winning smiles wherever she went. The little Shih Tzu became a beloved figure in the neighborhood, and soon everyone knew the story of her and Jake. At the end of each day, the family gathered in the living room, exhausted but united. Lucy would lie on the couch, snuggled between Jake and Ethan, while the two talked about the small victories of the day. Even in the tough times, it was clear that something had changed. A stronger bond had formed. But despite all the positivity, there was something still troubling Ethan. He knew that, no matter how hard they tried, the financial problems were still big, and he feared he wouldn't be able to give Jake and Lucy the security they deserved. However, deep down, he also felt that with the love and determination of their family, they could overcome any obstacle. Summer was progressing, bringing with it longer days and more intense work for Jake and Ethan. Their routine was starting to settle, but the peace was shattered by unexpected news. Ethan received a letter at the workshop where he worked. It was a formal eviction notice. The rent on the house had been overdue for months, and despite recent efforts, the debt kept growing. He read and reread the letter, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Jake immediately noticed something was wrong. Seeing his father sitting at the table, hands in his hair and a dark expression on his face, he approached cautiously, Lucy by his side. "What's wrong, Dad?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Ethan took a moment to respond, then finally handed the letter to his son. Jake read it quickly, his eyes filling with tears. "Are we going to lose the house?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ethan took a deep breath and shook his head. "I don't know, son. I'm doing everything I can, but it's not easy." He looked at Lucy, who seemed to sense the tense atmosphere and rested her head in Jake's lap, trying to comfort him. "I don't want you to worry about this, Jake. Just trust me. I'll find a solution." But Jake couldn't simply ignore the problem. In the following days, he began thinking of ways to help. With Lucy's assistance, he visited the neighbors, offering new services and carefully explaining his family's situation. Moved by the story of the boy and his loyalty to the little dog, people began offering more than just work. They donated food, money, and even items that could be sold. Ethan, initially resistant, started accepting the help reluctantly. He knew it wouldn't be enough to solve everything, but seeing the community rallying around them reignited something inside him. Hope. One Saturday morning, he and Jake organized a large yard sale. Lucy, with a colorful scarf tied around her neck, ran between the visitors, receiving affection and attracting more people. By the end of the day, when they counted the money raised, Jake looked at his father with a tired, yet hopeful smile. "It's not enough to pay everything, but it's a start," he said, excited. Ethan nodded, moved. "It's more than I expected. And, above all, it shows that we're not alone." But even with all the effort, both of them knew they would still have to face tough decisions. The garage sale was a success, but not enough to completely ward off the looming threat of eviction. Still, the community's effort left Ethan and Jake with a sense of unity and hope that they hadn't felt in a long time. However, the following morning, an unexpected twist changed the course of their lives. As Jake was walking Lucy down the street, a black car pulled up beside them. A well-dressed man with a friendly demeanor got out of the vehicle. "You're Jake, right?" he asked, smiling. Jake looked at the man, holding Lucy a little tighter. "Yeah, that's me." "Why?" he asked cautiously. The man introduced himself as Robert Hughes, the owner of a large local pet products company. Robert explained that he had heard about Jake and Lucy's story from a neighbor. "Your determination and love for Lucy are inspiring," he said. "And it got me thinking. My company is looking for someone to be the face of a new campaign about the bond between people and their pets. I think you and Lucy would be perfect." Jake was speechless. He looked at Lucy, who was wagging her tail as if she knew something good was about to happen. "You want us to be in a commercial?" he asked incredulously. Robert smiled and nodded. "Exactly. And, of course, you'll be very well paid." When Ethan first heard about the proposal, he was initially skeptical. But after talking to Robert and understanding the seriousness of the opportunity, he realized it could be the solution to his family's problems. In the following days, Jake and Lucy were taken to a studio to shoot the commercial. Lucy seemed to shine in front of the cameras, while Jake, with his authenticity, won the team over immediately. When the commercial was launched, the response was overwhelming. Jake and Lucy's story touched thousands of hearts, and Robert's company made sure to support the family continuously. With the money from the campaign, Ethan was able to pay off debts and even had resources to invest in a more stable future. But the most important thing was that, finally, the family had something no amount of money could buy: peace and unity. Jake and Lucy were facing hardships until an unexpected meeting brought a dramatic turn. A proposal saved the pair, showing the world their special connection. Discover this inspiring story that moved thousands. Subscribe for more.